name is Elise Boddie. I'm the director for the Inclusion Project. I am also the director for the Newark campus for the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice and a professor at Rutgers Law School. I started the Inclusion Project, which we call TIP, back in 2017. The Inclusion Project works to build awareness around issues of school segregation and why it's so important, to build awareness around what is possible, right? Can we dream a different world around public education? So often people are only comfortable with what they know, what they're used to. And so the educational function is really crucial when you're talking about reform. I was working very closely with a retired New Jersey Supreme Court Justice, the terrific Gary Stein, who had approached me about working on a case or helping to file a case against the state of New Jersey, challenging school segregation across the state in public schools and in charter schools.
I reached out to some peers, including Professor Boddie, who was very enthusiastic about the prospect, and others. And we formed a nonprofit. It's called the New Jersey Coalition for Diverse and Inclusive Schools. And we discussed the idea of organizing this lawsuit, and there was strong enthusiasm and support.
I wasn't, to be perfectly honest, I really didn't know how bad segregation was in the state of New Jersey until probably around 2013, actually, before I arrived at Rutgers Law School. And long after my husband and I had actually moved to the state. When I came to Rutgers Law School, and my law school colleague, Paul Trachtenberg, had done a lot of work about the problems of school segregation in New Jersey. When you look at the numbers, they are actually quite stark. We do have parts of the state where we have significant diversity, accidental diversity in public schools, but then other parts of the state that are extremely segregated for Black and Latinx students, as well as for white students.
I began to be aware because of studies that were done by a scholar named Gary Orloff out at UCLA and Paul Trachtenberg here in New Jersey. I began to be aware of the extent of the segregation in our urban schools, something that I had never known. None of the justices that served with me got any specific information about the extent of the segregation. We knew the urban schools had a bunch of poor Black and Latino kids, but we didn't know how bad it was. And when I saw these studies around 2015, 2016, that explained and clarified for me that New Jersey was the 5th or 6th most segregated school system in the country, worse than any school system in the South, and that there were some 275,000 Black and Latino children in New Jersey attending schools that were more than 90% non-white, I was horrified.
The most segregated states in the country are in the North and parts of the West, mostly California. So in other words, New Jersey is more segregated than Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, right? These states of the former Confederacy. New Jersey is more segregated than states of the former Confederacy. Let that sink in.
And the feeling was that, for goodness sakes, here's New Jersey, a progressive state in the North. How shameful, how embarrassing that New Jersey has a school system so many years after Brown. Brown was decided in 1954, so many years after Brown, that was worse today than the school systems in the South. And so we filed the suit on May 17th, 2018.
Today is a very important day in history. May 17th, 1954 was the date that the United States Supreme Court handed down the decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And in many ways, it was a hugely foundational decision for our country.
The wonderful, unanimous Supreme Court decision that finally held that the segregation in the South by law violated the equal protection rights of the Black school children that were discriminated against, because it deprived them of the opportunity to get an equal education.
Brown versus Board of Education applies to school districts that require students to go to different schools based on race. So what that has meant as a practical matter is that Brown, for the most part, has applied primarily in the South and in those areas of the country where there is more explicit segregation. Those areas of the country are sort of few and far between. In other parts of the country, like New Jersey, what we have is what we know is de facto segregation. And de facto segregation essentially means anything that's not by law, that's not required or mandated. And so segregation occurs in New Jersey, for example, because we have a bad history of redlining in this state, right, where we had federal disinvestment from the 1930s through the late 1960s, where the federal government refused to back mortgages in Black communities, while at the same time backing mortgages in white communities. And what that has meant is that we have investment, wealth accumulation in white communities, disinvestment in Black and Brown communities. And that has tremendous consequences for our public schools, because public schools are a significant portion of public school funding are property taxes.
The maintenance and the continuation of de facto segregation in New Jersey deprives our school children, the minority school children, the Black and Latinos, and candidly, it prejudices the white school children as well. It discriminates against all children and deprives them of the right to get a thorough and efficient education, because in today's world, a thorough and efficient education includes, in my judgment, the opportunity to intermingle and learn with and from children from backgrounds different than your own.
We know from the research that segregation is harmful. It's educationally harmful for schools that are under-resourced, and that's a huge reason for Brown versus Board of Education. In fact, the reason why the case was brought was because for many years, lawyers had worked to equalize resources for Black students across the South. And even though they were successful, the problem was that as soon as they, won a funding case, then the school districts would limit funding for Black schools. And so someone once described the problem as trying to empty a swimming pool with an eyedropper, because there were so many school districts around the South that they had to litigate against time and time again. So the theory of Brown versus Board of Education was that green follows white. In other words, money follows white students. So put Black students, and at that time it was very much about Black students. Latinx students had not, the numbers of Latinx students were much lower back then. But the theory of Brown versus Board of Education was to basically put the Black students in the same buildings and in the same classrooms as white students.
The social science research demonstrated beyond any doubt that economically disadvantaged Black and Latino children did much better when they got the chance to attend diverse schools. We learned that from the Southern schools after Brown against Board of Education. When the Southern schools desegregated, the Black children in the South advanced tremendously. And there were studies that showed how much better they did because they were attending diverse schools. the court I served on, the New Jersey Supreme Court, long before I got there, back in the 60s, in two very significant cases, Booker and Jenkins, held as a matter of law that de facto segregation, the kind of segregation, intense segregation that we have in New Jersey, violates the New Jersey Constitution. I knew about those cases. And it was on that basis and on the basis that I was frankly ashamed and embarrassed that our state had done so poorly in this area, had not lifted a finger to fix this, just as it had not lifted a finger to fix the funding imbalance in the urban districts, that I urged my colleagues to file this suit, and we did. And I think all children in New Jersey would have their educational opportunities enriched and enhanced if we could finally embark on a program to diversify our schools. And that's what this lawsuit is intending to do.
When I was working with Justice Stein, as we were trying to decide, when to sue, I suggested May 17th as a date that we should file because of its tremendous significance, to remind people of the historical context, which is so important because people in New Jersey don't think of segregation in a democratic, progressive, mostly state.
I give credit to Professor Boddie because she felt that the symbolism was extremely important and persuaded me
to explicitly link the work that we're doing now with Brown versus Board of Education, and also in the same way to signal why this issue is so foundational for the state, why it should matter so much to the people of this state, just in the same way that Brown had an enormous impact. We also have a tremendous opportunity here to really turn the page on public education in New Jersey. It's ironic that we have some of the best schools in the country, and yet such significant educational divides.
It's not going to be a quick fix, and it's going to take a while, and it's going to require a lot of effort and a lot of good faith and a lot of goodwill. But I feel this lawsuit will result in a ruling that prohibits what we do now and will require the state over the years to come to take significant, substantial steps to change the way we assign our kids to school. There are ways to do this. It just requires initiative, effort, planning, and goodwill. And that's what we hope to encourage the state to bring to the table once the court rules in our favor and determines that the existing segregation violates the state constitution.
I'm hopeful that the judge in this case, it's before the trial judge. I'm hopeful that the case is resolved in the right way. I also understand, though, that this is challenging work. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We need the courts to do the right thing in this case, and as I mentioned earlier, there's a significant body of law that they can rely on to reach the right conclusion. But it's also going to require the work, I believe, of the state legislature. I think it's going to require the work of communities around the state. This is an opportunity to really dream a world about what public education should be in this state, and I think this case will provide an opening for that. There's, I'm not suggesting that that the court can do all of that. I think it's part of a broader conversation. But if people are willing to lean into that conversation, we could really move the state to a much better place. And, a generation from now, 10, I won't even say generation, 10, 15 years down the line, and even 20 years down the line, people, will take for granted that, this is just the way that it always was, that we had educational equity in public schools. And, that's sort of the way it should be, right? You want to create opportunity for the next generation, and that's what we're trying to do.